Wednesday of Holy Week.
Happy Holy Week.
So one might think this is the conclusion of our retreat, but it actually isn't. There's going to be a reflection for Easter week, which we are actually going to do not next week, but the week after, since Easter is 50 days.
50 days of joy.
It is. And then there also will be a concluding session for this retreat. So we actually have 2 more weeks past this one.
Yeah.
So today's reflection is based on the trial of Jesus, that's the gospel, and kind of the juxtaposition between Jesus in the garden and Jesus during his trial. So let's hear the gospel before we begin.
So this is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 1 to 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish for me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
So in Tim's reflection this week, as I mentioned, he kind of talks about the difference between the agony in the garden and kind of how Jesus seems very anxious and worried, and is praying and how his mood and demeanor just shifts so dramatically, and he's almost resigned, I think is the word he uses, during his trial and during the Passion. So in his reflection, he talks about the dark night of the soul and how even Jesus appears to be kind of in this dark night of the soul, right? Like he's been abandoned by not only all of his friends, but he's feeling abandoned in some ways by God, or he can't feel God. So this is what St. John of the Cross writes. "It is fitting that if the understanding is to be united with that light and become divine in the state of perfection, it should first of all be purged and annihilated as to its natural light, and by means of this dark contemplation be brought actually into darkness. This darkness should continue for as long as is needful in order to expel and annihilate the habit which the soul has long since formed in its manner of understanding, and the divine light and illumination will then take its place." What Jesus shows in his experience of the trial is readiness to do what he knows the Father has asked of him, even to go to a painful death. This is Jesus' own paradigmatic act of faith, to trust the Father up to his death, even when the Father seems absent. So this quote from John of the Cross feels very heady to both Father Mike and myself, and we kind of like read it and went, wow. But then as we started talking about it, we realized that it really relates to kind of how sometimes when there is great suffering and you're either experiencing it yourself or you're witnessing someone else experience great suffering, sometimes like there's nothing to be said, right? And it's really about just being present to something. And I was sharing about an experience that I had with a couple years ago who had lost their only child, who was 22 at the time that he died very suddenly and unexpectedly, and how sitting in that meeting with these two people, even as a pastoral minister, I was just struggling to come up with anything. I mean, the weight of their grief and their suffering was so intense that I felt like there was just nothing that could be said, and all I could do was sit and kind of hold this place of just their deep pain with them. And I know you've obviously had a lot of experiences like that too as a priest, and so then we started kind of thinking about how maybe that's also God, that God's presence in these depths of suffering. He's there and he's present even if we can't feel him, because maybe there's no words, and that's what we can do, is just be present to each other.
Yeah, if we believe that God is always present, even God can be present to us in our suffering and is simply that, present.
Right. Even if we don't feel him, or we're not attuned to like experiencing it.
Yeah. And I was telling Francis too, as in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, the third week movement is the way to the cross. And the principal grace in that week is to walk along with Jesus, to see with his eyes what he sees as he moves through his trial, the agony in the garden, the trial on the way to the cross and his crucifixion. And that oftentimes the director, when he or she is working with a retreatant, often has very little to say to the retreatant. Simply to be present, oftentimes to just know words. But what really does speak, I think, is the presence of the person,
right,
receiving one's suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this week's prayer is, what does a meditative reading of the story of the trial stir up in you? What trials have you faced or are you facing? Can you find a place in your heart where you are willing to trust God the way that Jesus did? And you and I both also talked about our own experience of how difficult that can be sometimes,
mm-hmm.
and how we even fail at that in the midst, especially of great suffering or trials, to just really trust in God in that way that Jesus did.
I mean, it's so true, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the invitation every day is to lean into the grace of God, but then you add just daily life into the mix.
Mm-hmm.
Even a bad night's sleep can cause one to be a little bit more irritable and
mm-hmm.
less trustworthy,
mm-hmm.
right?
For sure.
So it's always leaning into that grace no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So the action this week is, in the coming days, set aside time to undertake the stations of the cross. Give yourself time to consider how meditating on Christ's way of the cross sheds light on the specific struggles you are facing. So simply, I mean, you could easily walk around our campus here at St. Joseph and make the stations of the cross.
Mm-hmm. Or inside the church.
Inside the church. I think the live stations of the cross were also filmed or recorded. And so you could find that on our YouTube site and watch that. No, you can't. All right.
Our director is telling us, no,
it's
they were not
available.
recorded.
Okay.
So you missed it. But it was, if you didn't see it, for sure go next year.
Yes.
because it is very moving. It definitely gives a real, you really get plunged into kind of all the roles. So it is something to see. So that's it for this week. Have a good rest of your week. We hope to see you all as we walk through Tenebrae, Triduum, and of course, celebrate the joy of Easter together. See you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
For this.